All right. Okay. So this is our third series of four. Um, Today we're going to cover behavioral supports and data collection. We have some other tidbits that we're going to tie in as well. There was a question last week about staff training, and so I added some slides on that, and then we're going to go into a little bit about discipline. Um, and a lot of the law is very Minnesota specific that I'm going to talk about today. And some of it will be brought up again next week. So just to have a heads up on that. Our training is made available because of a generous grant from the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, as well as Proof Alliance. And they made this opportunity possible so we could spread the information across the state. For conference information, today we are just going to talk about the law. I'm not giving legal advice. Laws change, and we'll talk about some new laws today. But also situations are different. Every kid is different. And so this information should just be viewed as the law and not as legal advice. If you're attending this conference with someone else that hasn't registered, please have them register so we can send out the video link to them. Other resources will be going out that way. And then at the end of next week's training, we'll be sending out a survey. We'll take a 10-minute break close to noon, and then I have time for questions. We will talk about questions at the end of the presentation as well. If you think of any questions while we go along, you can always submit them to Ruben, and he'll flag them. If there's anything crucial, he'll interrupt me. Otherwise, he'll bring them up at the appropriate times, or you can ask them when we take our breaks. And then again, if you have any technical questions, Ruben is your guy, so he can be emailed or messaged through this Zoom feature. Okay. Again, I'm presenting today. My name is Laura Eisner. I'm the Education Law Advocacy Project Staff Attorney. I started this position back in May of 2022. Before that, I was a prosecutor doing child protection, juvenile delinquency, and criminal cases for 10 years. I spent a lot of my time trying to develop alternative programs or interventions so that people didn't have to go to court. I switched roles for a lot of reasons, but one of them includes that I had a little baby that was in the NICU for 538 days. And I was gonna bring him home in an IFSP, which is like a little guy's IEP. And I just was very interested in this area of law. We also have a 6-year-old that has an IEP, so I've been familiar with the process. However, now I've dived deep into IDEA and I know all of the ins and outs and questioned a lot of my decisions early on before I started this position. So what is SMERLS? So SMERLS is the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services Organization. We cover all of Southern Minnesota. That's 33 counties. This is our unique map. And we help families with education law, but also if people are struggling with government benefits, immigration, housing, custody disputes, things like that. We help folks with that as well. If people live in our service area and qualify for our income guidelines, they get a free attorney. And I just mentioned this. I mentioned this last week and the week before, but this is the work that eLab works on, or the cases that we help with. We really do anything in the school or getting to the school. And the reason I bring this up is just to show that we have experience in our unit with our team and doing all sorts of things involving the school processes and navigating special education, discipline, bullying, English learner instruction. Okay, today we're going to learn about discipline, data collection, behavioral supports. I rearranged the agenda. So I sent out the agenda last week and again on Monday. And then as I was just practicing and going through my PowerPoint, it made more sense for us to start with the disciplinary stuff first. And so I rearranged the agenda slightly. I don't know if anybody was following that or cared, but I just want to let you know that we will at least address the discipline piece first. I think it gives us at least some understanding as to behavioral supports and needs, but also I wanted to make sure we had time set aside so that we could talk about data collection in more detail, since that is a very unique area of IEPs. All right, so first, there was a question last week about IEP team training. So I just wanted to touch on that before we go into anything else. So first off, we have our IEP team. This is people that we discussed last week. There is a rule here that I added in. There has to be a team member who's licensed in the student's disability. That could be covered by somebody else, but I just wanted to make sure that that was noted as well. But these people are all included on the IEP team. Okay. So when we're asking for staff to have training, this would fall within the program modifications and support section in the IEP for staff. There's also a program accommodations, modifications, and support sections for the child, but this is for staff. And IDEA, the federal law, requires that we would have something like this in place. There needs to have this information in here. So questions that we would maybe ask about what needs to be in there for supporting our staff to help our child would be, do we need to have any training or education for the staff to execute the IEP or implement the IEP, to promote progress in the general education curriculum, to support the student's development with peer relationships? Do we need to have some sort of plan in place if there's new hires along the way? If we get a new para, is there a training that we need to have, or education that needs to happen then? This can all be lumped into that section. Typically, when I ask for training for IEP staff, I put so we talk about the individual education program, right? So all of the documents in the IEP are kind of separate, even though they're a packet, right? And so under the accommodations, modifications, and support section, for the child, there should be this question about what we're going to offer for the staff. And so we'll plug this in there. Do we need to have training for new hires? Are we going to have a plan in place for when school starts? Before school starts? What special equipment is needed? Does a teacher need additional support in the classroom like a para? And some of this should also be in the service grid as well, right? Our IEP documents should all match each other. All the individual documents should match within themselves. But this should be listed there, and we can also talk about training then, right? What do we need to have for our staff to do well and be able to support the child? So I just listed a couple of training ideas. Of course, Proof Alliance, one of our co-sponsors for the grant, they do trainings with school on diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and impact on learning. MAN, which is the Multicultural Autism Action Network, they do trainings on autism spectrum disorder and the impact of learning. Learning Disabilities Association, they have the acronym of LAD. They offer trainings as well. Learning Disabilities ADHD Behavior are some of the main ones that they have. MDE has trainings on their website. You can ask for school staff to do trainings. We had a IEP that we were working on last year where the school staff didn't really understand like all the sensory tools or items that were available. So we have in there that at the beginning of the school year, the occupational therapist is going to meet with the school staff and everybody who's working with the kid to know like what our sensory tool options are, right? And we also ask that they make a menu for the child, but they can go through the tools, what they're used for, if they're, what they've seen as a benefit. Maybe we have some information on our data collection that they can share with the staff and that talk about that menu after it's developed. And then outside providers. This can be difficult, of course, because outside providers have to pay for their time there somehow. So that could be a question as to like how they show up and what, in what capacity. But we've had parents that have invited outside providers that have done assessments, evaluations, therapy. If a social worker has information on trauma history of a child, or how trauma is, kind of like either impacting them or coming out at school, all of this information can be training that we ask for and put in our IEP as a requirement for our staff that is working with the child. Now, we can also get training for parents. So I wanted to include this as well because it's not, parents can ask for and should get training if they need to, right? Parents training means assisting the parent in understanding the special needs of their child, providing parents with information on child development, and helping the parent acquire the necessary skills that would help them implement the child's IEP. And actually, IDEA lists some other things that can be offered to parents, such as counseling and guidance of parents regarding hearing loss and related services of audiology. doing psychological counseling or group and individual counseling. And then also they specifically listed counseling of parents regarding speech and language impairments and the related services speech pathology. And so this is information where we would, or sorry, this is training that we could ask for in the IEP, be offered to the parents, and essentially it helps the parent be able to use some of these skills at home that are being taught to the child at school. They helps them understand the disability or diagnosis if they don't have an understanding of that, where they are developmentally. All of this is really crucial, especially if it's like a brand new diagnosis that's just still being understood and something that can be included in the IEP and the parents can ask for. And it needs to be available at like to comply with the parent's schedule, right? Parents are working or, dealing with a child that has a disability, like it needs to be offered within and made available to the parent, regarding their schedule. So, okay, discipline. All right, so we're going to go into discipline. We will not go through everything on discipline because we could spend hours on this. We're going to start with the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act. This is very much Minnesota and only Minnesota. So the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act, we call it PFDA, just to add another acronym. It was written with the intent of having no public school denying due process or equal protection under the law to any public school student, right? So if they're involved in dismissal, tied to suspension, expulsion, or exclusion, the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act has information and guidance for schools and parents on how things are supposed to be done. Now, this law actually took under some revisions this last legislation session, excuse me. And so I've added in some of the new aspects of the law within here, but we don't cover everything. This is just kind of an overview of some of the most important details of this law. Okay, first we're going to do some definitions. We have the non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices. We have pupil withdrawal agreement that was defined in the law, dismissal, suspension, alternative education services, and then exclusions and expulsions. I will note we're very short on exclusion and expulsion because Ruben is going to present on that process and procedure next week when we talk about dispute resolution. So this is just a highlight of it, but we'll dive into that more next week. Okay, so one of the things that was new in August, or implemented through our legislative session that's new in statute this August, is this non-exclusionary disciplinary processes or practices and policies. To removing a student. So they list here that there should be alternatives to dismissing a pupil from school or student from school, including but not limited to evidence-based positive behavior interventions and supports, having social and emotional services, mental health, counseling, or social work services available to that child. Okay. They also added a definition for a pupil withdrawal agreement. It's defined in here, which I'll let you read, but essentially this is a document where if a student is at risk of being expelled or excluded for some conduct, the school would come forward and say, we want to have you sign this withdrawal agreement. We won't expel you because that goes on their record, but you can't come back and that, you can't, often they have that you can't pursue any other remedies such as filing a complaint with MDE or reporting any sort of unfair processes or, complaints to the Department of Human Rights, things like that. So they have a lot of prohibitions that are implemented within these withdrawal agreements. It was defined this year, and so it's a verbal or written agreement, often written, between the school and the student or the student's parent. And it would basically say the parent's withdrawing the student to avoid expulsion, and then whatever else is, required as part of that, that they won't re-enroll them for a year, that they won't file any other complaints or claims against them, that type of piece can be added into it. All right, so let's define dismissal. Dismissal means denying a student access to the current education program. Dismissal includes suspensions, exclusions, and expulsions, but it does not include removal from class. So if a child's sent down to like the principal's office, that's not covered by dismissal under the statute. For special education students, each dismissal from school consisting of 1 day or less counts as a removal towards the 10-day cumulative. So once we get to 10 days, we have to have certain things happen for special education students. And so if you send them home for suspension, exclusion, or expulsion, that counts towards those days. Okay, so they added, or I guess tweaked this language for the dismissal. They added that the non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and procedures must be attempted first before trying to dismiss a child or giving the child, well, the parent, a pupil withdrawal agreement. So this means that attempts to have social worker involvement or more, I guess, supports in school, however it looks for their non-exclusionary disciplinary policies and practices, they have to attempt that before they can start moving towards a dismissal proceeding or having them sign the withdrawal agreement, unless there's an immediate and substantial danger. Okay, so grounds for dismissal, this would be basically if you're being suspended, willful violation of any reasonable school board regulation, willful conduct that's significantly disrupts the rights of others to an education, or the ability for school personnel to perform their duties, and the conduct was willful by endangering the pupil, others, the school property. And the just so you know, on number one, and I have it here, of course, but the willful violation of any reasonable school board regulation has to be clear and defined. So it should be in the handbook about what the prohibition is, and then it needs to be clear that the student violated that piece in the handbook. Okay, so a suspension is a dismissal for no more than 10 days. If a suspension is longer than 5 days, the school must tell the superintendent why it's longer than 5 days. And then if for general education students, so if you have a student that has a 504 plan or no special education services or 504 plan supports, then your 1 day or less does not qualify as a suspension or a dismissal from the school. But if you're a special education student, you have that extra protection where it starts counting towards days where things need to be in place and there needs to be certain IEP team responses. Consecutive suspensions for the same incident are prohibited. So if there is an immediate or substantial danger, they can proceed with an expulsion, but you can't just say, okay, well, you're suspended for 5 days because you planned a fight, and then you're suspended for 10 days because you engaged in that fight, right? So that'd be 15 days. And so you can't just keep compounding them, even though technically it's all the same incident the same day. So it needs to all be one suspension timeframe. For suspension procedures, there is steps that have to happen. Informal administrative conference that happens prior to the suspension. And now with the new law, there also needs to be this discussion about what we're going to have for methods in place to reduce the suspension or not have a suspension in place. But we need to have this informal and administrative conference if we're moving towards that. And so it needs to have happened before the suspension occurs. Now, if the suspension happens immediately, it must be because the student is creating a danger to themselves or other people or property. And the purpose of this is to get the student's side of the story. If they do decide to suspend, then the school administrator shall notify the student of grounds for suspension as well as an explanation of the current evidence that they have. And again, the student should have the opportunity to present their version of the facts. And then they have to submit to the parent and the student a written notice of the grounds for suspension. All of this is outlined in the email or in the law here, Minnesota statute, for what needs to be included. But the main thing is that it needs to be sent to the parent, so the parent also has information as to the grounds, what's going on, description of testimony, if any students, reported what happened, what information they've gathered from the current child, the one that's being suspended. So these are the common with the regular suspension requirements that have happened. Now with the new law that we have to have the more equitable responses in place, that would be included in before the child is suspended, because they need to have that considered before anything moves forward with a suspension. So also new in August of 2023, the school must provide an alternative education service when a student has been suspended for more than 5 consecutive days. So this is for general education students, SPED students. They're supposed to be offered this alternative education service. And they're also supposed to allow the suspended student to work on assignments that are occurring as they are suspended. So if they're missing this week, the school should be providing them with those assignments and resources or information on how to contact the teacher to ask questions about those assignments so that they can complete their assignments and maintain, I guess, an understanding of the curriculum and stay caught up with their work. Educational services are, like I just said, are required to be provided by the district to the student with to a student with a disability who's been dismissed for more than 5 days. This is includes but is not limited to special tutoring, modified curriculum, supervised homework. So just having a discussion with the school about how that looks is really important for families, and making sure that something's in place. Okay. Full and equitable participation. This statute was expanded. So it was prohibited for a preschool child or basically pre-kindergarten, anybody that's before kindergarten that was in school to get suspended or expelled unless certain things fell in place. Now this is expanded from kindergarten through grade 3 as well. So they still can be dismissed for less than 1 day, except for a special education student, and have that not necessarily be a violation of the statute here. So if a child is in pre-K through 3rd grade, they could potentially risk expulsion or exclusion, but there has to be the non-exclusionary discipline that's been offered to them before they move forward with that. And so here on the slide is the non-exclusionary discipline. It includes one of the following that the school must do: either collaborate with the students, mental health consultant, special education, the family, community-based supports. They can create a plan with the parent that details the action and support needed by the student to fully participate in their current setting. That was added, that it has to be their current setting. Or provide referrals for parent education, home visits. Maybe they need to do an evaluation for a special education complaint, or special education evaluation, or 504 service. So there are added protections for our kindergartners through 3rd graders now, so that they can't just receive, I guess, dismissals without having some steps in place by the school. Okay, so just a couple of notes quick before I go into the manifestation determination review. So suspensions cannot be indefinite. That is not covered by Minnesota law. They have to be within that specified time frame. They can be up to 10 days. If it's beyond the 5 days, then the superintendent needs to be notified as to why. So suspensions cannot be indefinite. If there is a risk of the child being beyond the 10 days, I guess there is a permission for that to happen if the school is proceeding with an expulsion proceeding, but that needs to be clear to the parent that it's going to go beyond a suspension and go to an expulsion or exclusion. So just so that's clear to everyone that you cannot just have an indefinite suspension, come back when we tell you to come back. That's not a thing. Okay, so student with a disability. So if a student with a disability is at risk of being dismissed, one, then they need to have the process followed that's outlined in the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act of having the non-exclusionary disciplinary considerations. Do we need to have, different supports in place? Maybe a family meeting? What do we need to have in place? That all needs to be considered, right? But if we get to the point where then we are just dismissing the child or, suspending the child after 10 days of cumulative time over the school year. So if they have 2-day suspension at the beginning of the year, a 3-day suspension, and then we have a 5-day suspension, by that time where we now have a 5-day suspension, we should be looking at having a manifestation determination review because we've reached our 10 cumulative days. A manifestation determination review is a meeting where the school and the parent, and actually, so it's the whole IEP team, they review all relevant information and the relationship between the child's disability and the behavior that was concerning or causing the dismissal. The meeting has to be held within 10 school days. And if the behavior is found to be a manifestation of the child's disability, the school is required to move forward with a functional behavioral assessment. That's what we talked about last week. And what that it has specific findings that needs to be done. Or if a functional behavioral assessment's been done, that means that the IEP should have a positive behavior support plan already in it, right? And so if we have a functional behavioral assessment, we should look at the positive behavioral support plan or positive behavioral intervention plan for changes. Is it working? What needs to be tweaked? Why are we seeing, struggles in the school when we have this positive behavior intervention plan? And then the consequences for any problematic behavior should not be punitive against the child if it's tied to their disability. So here's just a quick summary on the functional behavioral assessment, just so that it's all together for you. If the student's disability sometimes manifests its way in a negative or harmful behaviors that impact learning, then the functional behavioral assessment should be completed. I used a different acronym here. I'm sorry. The positive behavior support plan is also sometimes called a positive behavioral intervention plan. But regardless, once your functional behavioral assessment's completed, you should take that data, that information that's completed as part of that assessment, and build your positive behavior support plan or intervention plan. And then we need to have a discussion about how the school would track behavior data so the IEP team can see if the IEP, including this positive behavior plan, is working. Okay. If a student has a disability and they have a behavior that is tied to one of the 3 things that are listed here, it doesn't matter if the behavior is tied to the disability. It doesn't matter. So if a student has a disability and their behavior involves bringing a weapon to school, possession or use of illegal drugs or selling drugs, infliction of serious bodily injury, which all of these are defined, very specific about what they include. But if any of these things happen and the child has a disability, even if the disability is tied to that behavior, the school can still recommend or have the child go to a 45-day interim alternative education setting. And so this would be a setting that's at a different school building. Typically, when we talk about levels and service needs, it's kind of considered like a level 4, right? It has higher staff, or I guess the student staff ratio is close to 1-to-1. And they work on some specific goals with that student. So it's a 45-day interim alternative education setting that they can recommend regardless of any ties between the behavior and the disability. Okay, now exclusion and expulsion. I had that we were going to define these just so it's clear. Exclusion is if the school board, through the series of processes, excludes a student from enrolling or re-enrolling for a period of time. This is for usually the maximum amount of time for this is the remainder of the school year. Whereas expulsion is a 12-month period when they're not allowed to be in attendance at that school. So, and again, Ruben will cover all of this next week. So if going back to our manifestation determination review though, if we have a student that had behaviors and the IEP team looked at the behaviors and the child's disability and they found that there was not a connection, that the conduct was not a manifestation of their disability, then the student can be excluded or expelled. If the student is excluded or expelled, the school needs to still provide special education services during that time frame, but that would look very different, right? It would be like at home or some homebound online, some programming that way, right? But they can start the process or procedure for an exclusion or expulsion if the child's disability is found to not be connected to the behavior. Okay, all right, I'm just going to touch on a few other statutes that are related to discipline, and we can go through those real quick here. If you have questions on these, they are new, and so you can shoot them in the chat and we will get back to you through email probably with our research if you have specific questions about them. Okay, so there is a new complaint procedure for discipline. So the discipline policy for the school must contain procedures for parents, teachers, other guardians, students, whoever to file a complaint. So if the parent sees a response by the school where their school is not following the Pupil Fair Dismissal Act or a different disciplinary statute, the school district must have a complaint procedure in place now for the parent to make a complaint to the school saying like, you didn't follow this law, or you know, the written notice that's required under the statute wasn't complied with, whatever, right? So they have this new option of making a complaint to the school about anything that's not being followed within disciplinary statutes, including that Pupil Fair Dismissal Act. Okay, there's also a recess detention statute that's all new. So I bolded the section that's on special education students, but the whole thing is brand new. So in this way, I don't know how often it was happening. I actually read this and I was like, oh, this. I always actually got recess detention because I didn't do well on my spelling tests. So that was a long time ago, but still, I'm glad that they have this in place. A school is encouraged to ensure students have access to structured breaks, right? We want our kids to burn off their energy and to support teachers in their efforts to use evidence-based approaches to reduce exclusionary forms of discipline. So we don't want to just keep children also away from their peers, right? If they go to recess and they are able to socialize, burn out energy, like that is a great thing that we want them to be involved in, and we want to reduce any sort of exclusion that they wouldn't be able to do that. So this statute prohibits the school from using recess detention unless the student causes serious physical harm to others, the parent consents, and if the student has special education services, then the IEP team must determine, so the whole team would have to determine that withholding recess is appropriate based on the individual needs of the student. So it cannot be used for incompleted schoolwork. If it is used, then the school staff must make reasonable attempts to notify the parent within 24 hours. And the school must collect data on how often the recess detention is being used and other information like age, race, other criteria, like if they're on special education plans, things like that. They must collect that data and they have to make it available to the public upon request. Also, kind of lumped into that recess section was a prohibition or I guess a section or clause on mealtime. And so under the recess statute, so it's the same statute, but they have the last part of that, they talk about how the school must not withhold or excessively delay a student's participation in scheduled meal times. There is not any data collection requirement for the meal times that I saw, but that is something that's now in place for kids. So, okay, that was a lot on discipline. Does anybody have any questions on that right now? And I can. Okay, Jonathan, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
I just had the question for the data collection for meal times. I know most schools require like they have a billing service system. Can you just request when they run up the transactions, confirm if students are getting their meals on time?
So I have not requested that data before. think that would be helpful if you have a concern about that. My only question is if that data would come through like a third party. Like when I pay for my kids' meals, it goes through like a different program. And I think that's how they like keep track of the finances, like, and like if I owe money. But that, so I don't know if you would request it from the school or from the third party, but that could be a way to definitely at least track if you have concerns that they're withholding or delaying the students' ability to have meals with their friends or eat for some reason they're um not allowed to be involved with that. But I guess that would also require that the student is getting the hot lunch too and not just eating cold lunch. But that is, I think, a great way to at least try to figure out some of that information. Um, so anybody else have any questions on, I guess, and we covered trainings that for the IEP team or anything on the discipline? Okay, so why don't we just take our quick break now? We'll do a 10-minute break
There's
now
one
and
question.
oh, yeah,
There was no data collection included for withholding meal times because that practice is not allowed under any circumstances. There should hopefully be no data collection at least.
that's
Is
a
what-
very good point. Yeah. So, um, I that would make sense. Yeah. So hopefully there should be no data to collect. If you do have concerns about that, I mean, that would be something to bring up to an IEP team, meeting. And when we go into data collection for other things, that might be something as well, just to see if there are concerns on a student's day, if they're being kept from certain things, having more detailed information as to like how the student's day is playing out um, could be helpful if there's concerns about that. So, okay, well, let's take a 10-minute break here and we'll come back at let's say 11:48 and we can start on the next topic. Thank you. All right. Okay. So I went and got some water. Thank you, Ruben. Um, we will go to questions. We took a couple before the break, but has anybody thought of any questions about anything in particular, or should we just jump into behavioral plans and things? Do we have anything, Ruben? My screen's not working properly. We good? Okay. All right. Okay. So what is a behavioral plan and when should an IEP have one? Okay. So positive behavior interventions and supports, this is IDEA, right? In their section on the development review and revision of IEP, IDEA has special considerations for when having an IEP, or excuse me, a positive behavior interventions and supports would be appropriate. So it says, in the case of a child whose behavior impedes child learnings or that of others, consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. And I have here, it says the IDEA requires behavioral interventions. That's not correct. I'll have to fix that on the slide. It doesn't require, it just has recommendations for when to implement them. So the regular education teacher of a child with a disability must participate in the development of the IEP of the child, including the determination of appropriate positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies for that child. Okay, so we have the positive behavior intervention plan. It's a proactive document that's included as part of the individual education program. It must be followed when we have one. It must be followed by anyone working with the child. It is developed from the information that is gathered from the functional behavioral assessment. So the functional behavioral assessment has gathered hypotheses about what behaviors are happening, what behaviors look like, if there's any intervention tools that have been successful or not successful. All of that's been gathered in our functional behavioral assessment. We then take that information and create the positive behavior intervention plan. These plans often include strategies to help reduce and prevent challenging behaviors by teaching new skills and reinforcing the new skills. Okay, I included my weird acronym list here because I've seen actually a lot more than this, but positive behavior intervention plan, behavior intervention plan is a BIP. Positive behavior support plan is that one, but I've seen a couple other ones. It's just, I think every school kind of has their own phrase for it, but generally the information should be the same. Minnesota has a rule on what should be included for behavioral interventions. This policy is intended to encourage the use of positive approaches to behavior interventions. So the objective of any behavior intervention must be that the pupils acquire, or the students acquire, appropriate behaviors and skills. And then they need to have all of those programming, the work with the student, all of that needs to be included in the IEP, as well as skills to help the student function as independently as possible. Okay, so and to summarize, then the purpose of our positive behavior intervention plan is twofold. We want to help the student improve behaviors or responses through instruction and support. And we want to decrease inadequate, unprepared, or reactionary responses from teachers or others that are working with the student. Basically, we want to build up supports for this child to have success in the school environment, however that looks. And we want to offer teachers information and data, hypotheses on why certain things are happening and how to respond. Okay, what can be in a positive behavior intervention plan? So these are things that can be in it. Again, you're gathering and putting information from your functional behavioral assessment in there, but your functional behavioral assessment should get this information to you. Details on the behaviors and the responses that are impacting the child's learning. Information or hypotheses on when and why the child is showing certain behaviors or responses. And I put often the phrase behavior, I think the phrase behavior is used in every statute or rule about this. However, I don't think we always need to look at it as a behavior, right? Not all of it's like a behavior where a child is acting out and throwing or hitting people. Sometimes a child is having a response. And so if that's like if they're feeling overwhelmed and they kind of shut down, giving them space and recognizing that that's a response is something that could be in a positive behavior intervention plan. When the staff should respond, and kind of like the who, what, where, why, how. Ideas on teaching replacement skills and how to support the student, offering supports to the student, what those are. Methods of evaluating the effectiveness of our plan. That goes to our data collection that we can talk about in a little bit here. And a plan for addressing unsafe behaviors. Now, sometimes, I'm just going to talk about this unsafe behavior section real quick here. I have seen plans where there are restrictive procedure plans for children. I have seen plans where they just try to work with the child to be in a safe space so that they can call the parent. If there are any sort of significant responses, like a child is, I don't know, banging their head pretty hard against something or whatever, trying to do some self-harm, where really they're not hurting anybody else, but they're engaging in unsafe behaviors, that we have a plan of who we're going to call and when, and like timelines. If the student does it once, we'll try to guide them slowly away from the space. But if it happens twice, or multiple times, then we need to have a call to mom to try to either have a phone call between the child and the parent or have her come pick them up, whatever, right? So having the unsafe behavior, obviously it depends on the child, the behavior we're seeing, and then how the school can respond as a supportive measure, whatever that looks like, right? But just that should be included. Okay, sections of the positive behavior interventions plans can include these, and they don't have to. Just like the fact that we have like 5 different acronyms for the plan, I've seen many different ways that these plans are written. A lot of the strengths of our plan, or like if we have a good positive behavior intervention plan, really is going to rely on our functional behavioral assessment anyways. But having kind of headers and breakdown of information really helps people digest the information in a positive behavior plan rather than just having blocks of information or blocks and blocks of paragraphs that don't offer any help. So the need for a positive behavior support plan or intervention plan is kind of like the PLAF, that present levels section. Like, what are we seeing that's a need? What is our struggles that we're having in school? What behaviors are impacting the child's learning? The student's strengths, a hypothesis statement. So if there's certain things that are seen to trigger, or we have guesses as to what might be happening, putting that in there. These can always be changed. And the IEP team should be discussing them as they get entered, right? It's not just one person's hypothesis. It should be a discussion. Antecedents, which were leading up to the behavior, preventative strategies. Can we do something that will direct the student's attention from if we're worried about them eloping from the classroom, but they really love this particular stuffed animal. Maybe every time we see them kind of get up and do their first steps towards the door, we get out the puppet or the stuffed animal that, so that we try to encourage them to stay in the classroom, and maybe the puppet or the stuffed animal can sit with them and do their math assignment or whatever. Replacement skills. So not only should we just we shouldn't be just redirecting people, but what skills are we going to work with them on? Now, this is a debate, of course, because children with neurodiverse children that are neurodiverse, maybe their replacement skills aren't going to look like neurotypical replacement skills. So this needs to be a conversation that the IEP team has. But it's important to have that conversation, right? To make sure that the child has some skills to at least work on or develop that would help them be successful. And obviously what you're expecting for certain developmental ages versus others is going to be different. The child's going to be different. What they're interested in and their responses are going to be different, but having them have some sort of skills or something that the staff can teach them when they're not in a heightened state is something that will be helpful to have in your positive behavior intervention plan. What the interventions are, the crisis intervention plan, like if you're going to agree that the child can be held or put in like some sort of like restriction area. Maybe it's that we call mom, if there's a disruption or the child is like melting to the floor because they're so anxious, right? How are we going to have one of our significant crises have a response? And data collection. So this is not I won't say this is like something sent from like the sky above that will save everybody. Positive behavior interventions plans are some things that can cause a lot of students some stress, but it also is a tool, if developed correctly and communicated correctly, that can help students build on their skills to function in the classroom and engage with education. And even if it's just maybe the replacement skill is asking for a sensory item. I mean, it doesn't need to start out where we're learning how to like self-regulate, right? Having some steps in place that would just be helpful for your particular child and their circumstances is something that can be beneficial, and it offers teachers and staff working with the student guidance on what to do versus them just making stuff up on their own and not having any sort of review or assessment about what's actually working and what's not. So anyways, we'll come back to this in a little bit here, but so I just wanted to talk on goals and progress reporting. We talked about this last week, but we're going to go into data collection, and so I just wanted to do a quick summary. So here's our nice flow chart on getting an IEP. So we have the child identified, we do the initial comprehensive evaluation, child qualifies, we do our IEP development with goals, and then we implement our IEP. So our goals, which are and are part of our development, right? Each goal should have the following information, right? With the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. The measurable, and I put that in gold because it's really needs to be measurable, annual goal, and benchmarks, short-term objectives, how the progress towards meeting this goal will be measured. And it's measured, I have that twice. And really what's crucial, I guess, to point out here, someone had asked before the difference I think it was the first training, the differences between the 504 plan and the IEP. Your IEP has these goals and has a measurement requirement. That is one of the cornerstones of an IEP. And so making sure you have a good goal and that it can be measured is crucial. Whereas a 504 plan just has supports or modifications, accommodations in place, right? It doesn't have anything that needs to be measured. We don't need to know how the child's actually doing. We just are making, test timing longer. And we don't need to track and see how things are going. But this IEP, that's your idea. Language for the IEP is just that having this goal and having it measured and tracked is what makes it an IEP versus just a 504 plan. Okay, how to determine if a goal is a good goal. Each goal will name a skill or behavior the child should learn and the progress the child will make. Each goal should be challenging but attainable. And we want to think ahead about where the child should be in a year. Each goal will explain what skill will be measured and who will be measuring it. Okay, for progress reports, how do we know if services and supports are properly in place to help the student reach their goals? We get our progress reports. And we want to remember that grades and goals are different. So if we want our progress reports or information on how we're doing on goals earlier than our grades or at a different time than our grades, the progress report language and case law support that it has periodic reports are required. It gave examples in the statute, but it doesn't have that those examples have to happen. It can happen when it's appropriate and necessary for the parent, the IEP team to know how the child's doing. So when periodic reports on the progress the child is that the child is making towards meeting the annual goals, we need to know when that's going to be provided. In order to have a progress report, that should have summary of the data that's been collected to show how your child is doing in reaching their goals. And if the progress report's been sent out, but the school doesn't have data collection to support their progress reports, that could be a sign that the child's not meeting their goals. Oh, there's a typo, I'll fix that. And as it's written in the IEP, right? So we need to have data collection to know if our progress reports, or to make our progress reports and to know if we're meeting our goals or getting close to them, or if there's gaps, right? All of this information's here. So, all right, on to data collection. So our question here when we do the data collection is, basically, is the IEP working? Okay, the purpose of data collection in the IEP is to measure progress. So we want to measure progress or lack of progress. We want to make sure that the services and support are helping our child, or the child that's identified by the school in the IEP. What maybe there's goals or services that need to be changed, right? This will help us understand what's going on. And the data collection should be individualized, and the data collection should be focused on the goals of that student. I haven't seen it, but I talked to a different education law attorney, and they had reported that they had gotten a progress report for a student, and the progress report said like that the student was really pleasant to work with. And that was pretty much it, which is nice. We're very happy that the student was nice to work with, but it had nothing to do with the academic goals or the behavioral goals for that student. Hers was all academic too, so it's like we don't know if the child can read, but she's nice to work with. Well, that's wonderful to share, but our data collection should be on, sounding out letters or reading long passages and understanding what the content is. So, okay,
Laura, do you have
yes.
any advice on how parents can request an actual progress report when the schools usually have the progress reports at the parent-teacher conferences?
Yes. So if you are struggling to get progress reports, I would go to your team, your IEP team, and ask for progress reports to be offered more frequently or spaced out differently than the conferences. There is, like I said before, last week, and just briefly mentioned now, there's a case that talked about progress reports that the statute here, let me go back. The statute says that when periodic reports on the progress of the child is making towards meeting the annual goals, such as the use of quarterly or other periodic reports concurrent with the issuance of report cards, will be provided. But there's a case where they talked about, this is just an example. It doesn't have to go out with report cards or out with, other updates. And again, grades are different than goals. And so if we need to know how the child is doing, we might want to know actually before we get our grades, right? If we're really struggling, or our child is floundering with certain particular issues, asking for that to be changed in your IEP is the first step. And having that meeting with the team is going to be really important, right? Where you sit down with your IEP team and you say, here are my concerns. Number one, the progress reports are only coming when I have the conferences with the school, so we're unable to make changes before we're getting grades out or whatever, and propose a change that way. Now, if the school disagrees with you and is unwilling to make any changes, next week we will talk about dispute resolution options, and we'll go through all the options there if you're unable to get a change just through having that first IEP meeting. Okay. So data can look 100 different ways. I mean, it's supposed to be individualized, right? Whenever I've requested data sheets or data information, I've gotten just a variety of information from the school. So we have just your data sheets that are like Excel spreadsheets. I have tracking forms. They have ABC data forms, which we'll go into in a little bit. We'll explain those. Observation notes, checklist, student work, teacher records, survey data, quarterly feedback forms. This, when we get to the goals, right, of your IEP, should be listed in your IEP how they're collecting data. If your IEP goal does not have how they're collecting data, that's a red flag, right? How are we going to make sure they're reaching their goal if we're not going to get data on this particular behavioral goal, academic goal, functional goal, right? Okay. So here are some team questions that we might want to ask. So what data should be collected? Are we looking at a goal that's academic, behavioral, functional? I had a little guy that was struggling to follow multiple step instructions. And so they worked with him also on hand washing because he would I think I talked about this before, but he would walk away with soap on his hand, right? And so they would help him with that. And so how are we going to collect data on him doing this functional task to make sure we're following through the 8 steps checklist or whatever? How is it going to be collected? Are we doing spreadsheets, different types of assessment? Is it observation? Has the team reviewed the data collection document and assessment to make sure that the data collection is going to be meaningful? Are we looking over this with the team? Have other people seen this document? Is it something that's going to actually pull out meaningful data for us? Or is it just, Sally was nice today? And we didn't read because she was so sweet. I don't know, right? We need to have these documents shared with us. How often is it going to be collected? Weekly, daily, monthly? Is the information going to be shared? If not, how is the parent going to ask for it and collect it? How will the team analyze the data to know whether or not your child's making progress? Do team members need know how to collect the data? So if we have a data collection thing where the general education teacher might see some of the skill development or the goal aspects that are being measured, do they know how to share that information in like a Google form, or do they just send an email to the special education teacher? How are team members going to collect this data? Who is collecting the data? Is it everybody? Is it just one person? Who's going to interpret the data? That should be also clear, right? And are the goals clear and understandable? If we don't have clear and understandable goals, right, which we talked about last week, how are we going to even do data assessments on anything if we don't even know what we're doing? And a lot of this is just making sure everybody's on the same page, right? Because your IEP team, you have people from all different aspects and backgrounds working with the child, just making sure we're on the same team, on the same page as we go forward and collect data. Okay, so I summarize this with 4 main things. And this is just to help people kind of take a step forward when working with on the IEP team and discussing this. So is the data collected compliant with timelines? So we need to collect the data, whatever, monthly, but then we're going to report it twice a year or quarterly, or we need to figure out how we're going to get this data collected within the timelines and just have that needs to be ensured. Is the data detailed? Do we pull out specifics? If the child is throwing shoes, like why, where, who, what, how? We need to know more information rather than the child was dysregulated and he threw a shoe at me. Relevant to the IEP goals. So we had the one example last week where we talked about how in the progress report, it actually mentioned that the parent had canceled a meeting. Well, that's not here nor there. If they canceled a meeting to talk about something that doesn't actually have to do with anything at all, because the parent does not have an IEP goal. Does the information gathered and the information shared then in our progress reports actually help be tied to our IEP goals? Is it relevant? And do we have anything measurable in this collection? Do we have dates of occurrences? Are we getting test results back so we can compare and contrast from last year's test results? Do we have, I guess sometimes students have particular issues with different staff. Are we tracking which staff is having different behaviors? And maybe it's not necessarily staff's fault, but if a child is really struggling to be in gym class and they're upset about it, maybe the gym teacher is going to see more behaviors, and we just need to figure out if it's a situational thing, a relationship thing, what's going on, right? But if we have that data, we have some information about times and dates and when things are happening, we can start measuring out to see when occurrences are happening and if we're going to meet our goal, what changes we need to have to the IEP. Okay, here are some examples that I got through my request for data collection. I have cut and paste and removed information, but this is some general information just so you can see what I have seen for some of my data collection requests. So here is the behavioral document. They did, I did like a screenshot and they did up here at least have the date of when they were doing behavioral documentation, but that was it. That was sent to me. It's like, I don't know when things were happening or why. Here, I thought this chart was really cute. Not particularly helpful, but really adorable. So the little child was just obsessed with Baby Yoda, right? Like they're using the chart as like a way to help them understand their day and kind of process their schedule. And whether or not the schedule is being followed, other things like how are they doing with completing tasks throughout the day. And so they have a baby Yoda in the little pod if he or she does well, out of the pod if he or she doesn't do well. Any notes here? It does have a lot of text for this being just for a little guy. But they had photos actually of some of the teachers, so that he knew what was going to happen. And the staff could tell the child what was going to happen next and who they were meeting. At the bottom of this chart, they actually had some codes, which I guess this is an individualized chart. They have that for sure. They said if there was a wanted behavior, tell the student that she did well and how that made other feel. If there's an unwanted behavior, you said, "Oh no, Baby Yoda got away. Why do you think Baby Yoda got away? What can we do to catch Baby Yoda next time?" And then be sure to practice. But it didn't have a whole list of skills. But then I guess you'd suppose you'd go to the positive behavior support plan to get those skills. But they at least offered some suggestions for staff using this on the same document. It says for each open pod, so each Baby Yoda that you circled, or missing Baby Yoda that you circled, I guess, then you're supposed to complete the ABC checklist. And I have an example of that in a few slides here. And then they have additional notes that were at the bottom, like you're supposed to offer scheduled breaks if her body's not ready to do the work. There's a code word for unexpected events. So if there was a fire alarm, then the code word would be like Jedi training. And then apparently the staff and the student would try to work through an unexpected event when their schedule was very rigid. So this offered some information, and I mean, I don't know if it offered or matched all of the goals and measurements that way, but it did offer some feedback to the parents, at least so they could see what was happening during the day. Here's one that I got. This was pages and pages of dates and tallies. I'm assuming the tallies were somewhere else because this was just like an Excel spreadsheet that they sent me. I had no notes for anything. And then the total at the end of the day. And I don't even know the problem with this one. Well, there's a lot of problems, but the one I didn't know like if these all happened at the same time. Was the physical like he hit twice and then spit once? I mean, is that all the same incident? I don't know what triggered it. So this is one of the things that I saw. So okay, I have two graphs here. Is the student persistent when things are hard? And does the student stay on task? These ones were very frustrating for the parent once we got them and reviewed what the data looked like, because we had this chart, which did not really make any sense to us. But then when we found out how the data was collected, the information didn't seem very clear. The special education director would email out a Google form for the general education teachers to fill out once a quarter. And then they would fill out what they remembered from that quarter as to whether or not the student was persisting when things were hard. I don't really know what 3 or 4 meant because that wasn't defined anywhere. Or if she stayed on task. And the parent and I were talking about this. The concern here, of course, is that when people try to remember stuff, they remember things that stick out, such as dysregulation, or other concerns like that, versus like if she's sitting there doing homework, it's not going to be as memorable, right? And so we had concerns about how that data was being collected and then put together in this form chart, I guess. I received this along with, I don't know, 35 other pages from a data collection form or chart request. There was no name or well, I knew who the client was, but there was no like name about who collected the data, if somebody sat down with the child, dates of when these things were done. And with the 30 pages, I wasn't sure if it was all done like in a week or what we're gathering from this. So, but this was part of their data collection. Maybe it was going to be assessed later, but I never got that. I just got giant packets when I asked for data of like workbooks. Here's an engagement task data form that was used for a student. So this staff was asked to like identify how the student's level was, like energy level. So they had to list the activity, put down their energy level based on what the staff was seeing. And then they had to list the number of prompts, but I don't know if that was like the prompt to like ask them to get it done. Does that count as the first prompt, second prompt? That was not really clear to us. And then at least this one had like staff and some more, had more dates, so information so we could track a little bit better. Okay, and then the antecedent behavior consequent. This is the ABC analysis. These ones have, this is a longer form. Often ABC forms that I've seen when I looked it up have been just basically 3 categories, and maybe the staff's name or date, antecedent behavior and consequence. We've asked for more information in this, and this actually was very helpful for my one case. Once we started using this form, we were able to really help the staff. Parent and I were able to team up with the IEP team to offer suggestions that would help the staff be successful. The school was pushing for a level 4. Once we got this in place, we were able to give feedback to the staff to help them navigate the situations, the behaviors that they were seeing, and they withdrew that and they took it off the table because his behavior stopped. Once we knew what was going on, they stopped. Not to say that this is perfect, but it is, I guess, it's something that at least worked for one of my clients. Date, time, how long it lasted. If it's a 15 minutes of time, that was one thing that we had to add later on. Because one staff went in and added something like every 5 minutes, and it's like, well, he was upset the whole time. It was one duration incident. But anyways, we asked for like just list it as one thing. What did they see? You know, was he throwing something? Was he hitting? Oh geez, see, sorry, it went so fast. Where was it happening? And this is actually one of the kids that was having, he was struggling a little bit with gym. And so he often used a wheelchair. I think there were some stressors there that was tied to not being able to keep up with his peers. And so he had some behaviors and often it's more responses, like he was refusing to engage because it was just hard for him to sit through gym. So we listed precursors, like what was happening before anything happened, you know, and so was he saying no? Was he mumbling, not responding to you? Other things that were listed they could put here. What happened prior to the behavior? Did they say you had to wait, or there was some task that they just really didn't want to do? We just really don't want to do math today. We were asked to do math, and that was what kind of led us down this path. And then the consequences. And there actually, the school was willing to do this. They marked plus if it was successful and minus when it wasn't. And mom helped give out a lot of options, like things that really helped redirect him when he was getting stressed out. So sometimes he like perseverated on different things. And so just telling him that something would happen later was enough to help him calm down because he just needed to know like when things were happening. But if it's happening later, at least we know that. Reassure him that things are okay. Provided weighted blankets for the sensory tool options, being silly. We actually in the IEP and the positive behavior support plan, this little guy, every day was his birthday, like every day. It was just so great being him. And so we put in there like talk about his birthday because every day was his birthday. Like he was just having a great day usually. Things didn't always go well, but you know, then and based on using at least this form for this particular client, individualized form for my individualized client, we were able to help our staff, help the team that was working with him reduce any behaviors. So often he wouldn't get up to do anything like hit anybody or throw anything, but if things were near him, he might get mad and throw it. And so there was one time where they were trying to get him ready for gym and he was really fussing about putting on his shoes. And so then the para put the shoes on his lap. And so he threw the shoes at her. Well, it's like, well, so we worked through that. Like, don't give him stuff when he's starting to get, showing that he has these precursors, right? We have these precursor signals that we know are going to happen or possibly result in some behaviors, right? And if you give him his space, like don't crowd him, give him his space, he can calm down, and he can usually calm down in a pretty short time. He just needs his space. And so based on that and a lot of the data we collected, we went through the work that the school was doing, and we were at least we were able to get the level 4 off the table, and he stayed. He's very happy, and mom's very happy with where they're at. So, but what was crucial and what was so important when we were developing this is to make it for them, right? Make it for that child, because this stuff might not work for anybody else, right? It's for that child, like what we need to have in place to help that child be successful. So, okay, and that's called the ABC chart. But this is a very complex one. Other ones that we've used or seen in other schools are very much more like maybe 5 grids at the most just for filling out stuff. But you can ask for more always and try to collect as much data you can. So, okay. And I guess I wanted to mention, so we have our goals, right? Our goals could be for academic, behavioral, functional, like we talked about. So this would be maybe a chart or something we would want to use for a behavioral intervention or plan. It could also be for a behavioral goal. If you have a positive behavioral plan, it doesn't necessarily need to have a goal in it, but you can still do data collection on the interventions that are working or not working. And our academic goals might have other collection of data, right? We might have more worksheets where we're going through and, I might get a packet of 35 worksheets again. Right? But we need to, I guess, just make sure that as an IEP team, we know what we're trying to collect and why and who's doing all of that collection. So, okay. So we're going to do some group work. So Ruben, I think maybe we should do 15 minutes and that will give people time to talk. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we're going to divide you guys up. All y'all, I should say. Everybody's going to be divided up into 6 groups. Your group number is going to be your goal that you're evaluating. So I have emailed out today 6 hypotheticals. We will send them in your chat feature as well for your breakout session. So you'll have them in the chat as well. And the goal is, as part of this, is to just try to practice having discussions about data collection, because this is just a very unique area of special education law, and not a lot of people have these conversations or talk about it. So it's just to try to practice talking about it and kind of assessing where we're at. And as a nice surprise for everybody, nobody gets any data today. I'm just going to give you a goal, and I want to have you just have a discussion about what's missing, what are our questions, what do we need to have in a data collection review, right? What's helpful? Does our goal even have how data is going to be collected, right? All of these things can be looked over by your team. So this is our hypothetical. There's a student that has 6 goals in their IEP. You are reviewing some of the progress reports and their IEP goals. So the first 2 goals are progress reports and the last 4 are IEP goals. So just so you know kind of how it's going to look. As you go through these, you start to have concerns about how the data is being collected. Okay, so that's going to be a discussion. Then you're going to talk with your team, figure out who's going to come back and report to us. And then I have questions here of things to consider, like if the data was collected to assess progress, if the collection method was is proper for this goal. Do we have questions about how data is being shared or being gathered? What changes might you consider proposing to the IEP team? And that's like the biggest one, right? Like, what do we think's missing here? And you don't have the data, right? So it's going to be hard. But as you're working through these IEPs, a lot of you're not going to have the data to start with anyways. You're going to get an IEP, you're going to go through it, and you'll be like, well, maybe I need to look through the data. Yeah, is it 1,000 Post-it notes? Is it a Excel spreadsheet? Whatever, and gathering that information to see how we're doing. So there's some questions that came in the chat. Let's see here. Oh, thank you, Ruben. He shared the group document with everybody. So okay, What we'll do is we'll divide you up into your groups. Again, whatever group you are in is your goal that is assigned to you. And we will come back and have a discussion in about 15 minutes. Ruben, do we need to have them join or can we just put them in the room?
They'll
I think
have
I
to
could.
join, but
Okay. Oh, thanks, Ruben. You got that. Thanks, Ruben. Okay, so I did get a message here from someone in the chat. It doesn't say who is doing this with the student, how often they are going to be measuring the student. Yeah, so it has 4 out of 5 consecutive charting days, but yeah, it's not clear. I guess like if that's gonna happen regularly. And
Laura,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Laura, this is Jackie.
Yeah.
I would think, I don't know, for there to be like measurable goals, it should be in the progress report and in the IEP, or I would think that who is actually doing it with the child, because if you have multiple different people going to be just working with the child, like whoever is available at this time, that's not going to be effective for that child to accomplish that goal, because each time that child is just seeing that person, hasn't made a relationship, hasn't connected with that person that's doing it with them. And then I don't know if I can't see everything. I am only seeing like the one date, but you said 4, but it's, I know it says 4 out of 5. I see it says consecutive charting days, but what were those 4 out of 5 consecutive dates was, and then it doesn't also indicate, because I know I did have a child that did have some things that were needed. It also, sometimes I think it should be charted what the child's condition was. I know my daughter had asthma,
Mhm.
and in one of the dates that they were working with her, she came home and told me that she really wasn't feeling good. She had an asthma attack, and the nurse had to come and get her. They never mentioned anything about that, and it wasn't noted anywhere. So how could you actually be counting that?
That's a good point. Yeah. And
So I don't know.
I like your point on charted by special education staff, right? Like, is that everybody? Right? How many people are considered to qualify as special education staff? I think that's a
Yeah.
really good point.
So
So, yeah. Um, and then what are the data collection tools? Yeah, that's a very good question. So someone put that in the chat. Measured by data collection tools. What is that? Is it an assessment or observations? What do our data collection tools mean? What, like, what all are we using in our toolbox to assess? So those are great questions, great points. Okay, so I think number 2, Jonathan kind of talked about this a little bit, right? There was just a lack of following through with, I think, some. Jonathan, can you summarize what you said again? Were you talking about triggers?
Like antecedents and triggers
Mhm.
and just like what's involved in those interactions. This very much feels like a staff person who's understandably got frustrated and kind of regurgitated a summary of their experiences and what they see the child doing. But that isn't very helpful. And including specific contextual observations like the list of emails that people probably generated linked to this document, or incident reports, or from different staff, and like where in the building, like what is going on, linked to the calendar that's going on, like sort of like the asthma attacks and other stuff, like so we have enough context around the situation for what is consistently happening with the student,
Mhm.
that this can be identified.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great points. Does anybody else have a comment or any thoughts or questions, I guess, on goal 2 here, where um, he was to increase his ability to appropriately respond to adults and peers, because he had been responding with swearing, name calling, or refusal, and they wanted him to jump up from 25% to 75% in being able to respond without swearing, name calling, or refusal.
This is
Well, I guess it just says student has made adequate progress on this goal. There's no data to support it, or actually even, I shouldn't say that, there isn't a number attached to like what did the child increase by, from to what? What was the percentage of the progress? It just says adequate progress. What, and then I know sometimes I've seen where they'll identify adequate is this percent to this percent, or this, that's not even here. So we don't really know, other than a word, how that child really did progress and their goal. The goals are critical. And I feel like sometimes staff, special education staff, don't take them always as serious as they should. I've actually said that in meetings. They get offended, but oh well. If that's what you're really not feeling like you're doing when you have to write up what you've done, if this is what you've done, you didn't really take it as serious as I felt you should have.
It's like, to take what's happening in this meeting is when I get confused looking at the wrong page and the wrong goal here. Like if 1 out of 4 times you redirected me, if I was swearing, like, that would be exactly what this goal 2 is written as. If 1 out of 4 responses was the child swearing, is what the goal and what is there is written as. And I don't think that's realistic because that measures every redirect response. And we don't have a data line of how many times is the child redirected in a given day or over a given a week.
Yep. Maren, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add, when our group was talking about this, we also discussed that there's a lot missing from the goal itself. It doesn't give us a time frame. It doesn't say who's going to measure. It doesn't say how they're going to measure. And the progress report really isn't a progress report at all. It's just a statement. So as I think it was Jackie had mentioned, there really isn't any data there to be able to respond to. And it's great that the student has made adequate progress, but it doesn't really talk about, how that's going to be supported going further, or what was done differently to support, the student's progress. So it seems like a real missed opportunity.
Yeah. Anybody else have a comment or thoughts on goal 2? Okay, we'll jump to 3. So goal 3 is that the student will increase her understanding of social language and usage of social communication to increase her positive peer interaction skills, from recognizing nonverbal communication, making social inferences and reciprocal conversations from occurring 55 to 80% of trials, and documented observations to occurring consistently in 70 to 80% of trials, and recorded observations during structured activities. And then they have a benchmark where she's going to turn her body towards the speaker, make eye contact, take 2 conversational turns on a topic of non-interest. And they're going to be making comments in 80% of opportunities over 3 measuring days as observed by the speech language pathologist. At least this goal has some documents that we can request that we know should exist, right? We know, according to the IEP, that there should be data sheets, there should be observation notes, and there should be a parent/teacher report. I guess particularly with this one, I brought this to my client and we were talking it, and I was like, well, what's the parent-teacher report? She's like, I have no idea. So that's just something to keep in mind, is when they're putting together this, the measuring goals here, is to make sure you actually know what's, what you're gonna collect and what's the documents are. Because if you're gonna have a parent-teacher report, that's one side of the group that needs to be able to talk to the school that doesn't know how to share information or what that document's going to look like. So does anybody else have thoughts on goal number 3?
I was gonna say there's the data sheets. I don't know what that would look like. Are they like, are we looking at a forms document? Is the student going to be the one interacting with it?
Yeah.
And what the observation notes are going to tell. I mean, it'd be important to detail if does she get a 0 if she only does one of the two? Like if she just makes eye contact but doesn't turn her body, does she get half points, or is that have to be a full objective?
Right. Yeah. Marin, your hand came up first.
I just wanted to point out that this is a really ableist goal. So
Mhm.
aside the fact
Yep.
whether the data collection is good or bad, I would encourage people to
Yeah.
talk to the school about that.
Yeah, we actually talked about that this last training, that this was whether or not this is a good goal to begin with. There's a lot of questions about other things, just even the structure of it, but just it is not driven for neurodiversity students, and so that's just something to kind of keep in mind for all goals. How, just to make sure that they're individualized and good for the child. That's the target of the IEP. Jonathan, go ahead.
I the data collection and everything around this is beautiful, and will like just to play off Mara, and like what this is going to allow the child to do is come back and sue the school for ableist abusive therapy. Like, and I love it. The goal is like we should change the goal, but like I love that like the data is supported.
All right, so we're gonna go to number 4. Another one that, just to keep in mind, was written maybe not with neurodiversity in mind, but it nevertheless was a goal. And so I think that these are good conversation goals to have out there so people understand what's being proposed. But I guess group number 4, if you have any feedback for us.
Yeah, we talked about that. It wasn't very simple, like you had already mentioned, maybe simplifying it.
Mm.
Because I don't know, just as a student looking at the objective, you know, what teacher am I reporting things to? Is it a specific teacher if I need to have support? Do I go to any teacher, counselor within the school day? There's no hows as far as how the information is going to be measured specifically, what that looks like. So
Yeah.
it just seemed too complicated. It could be simplified.
Okay. Anybody else have comments or thoughts on goal 4? On data collection, or I guess concerns on data collection? So one of the things that we've just to keep in or flag for yourself, teacher observations, that might be a great tool or a great way to collect data, but it is really important to have specificity about how that looks, right? Because you're asking someone to take a person to then implement like an objective view on what a child is doing or what a student is doing, right? And so just to kind of question about how that's going to be measured, if it's maybe in some situations it might be helpful, maybe it's not, just to kind of have that conversation with the IEP team to make sure that that's something that you want and that you know how to get the information from, and that it's done on a consistent basis, right? So if you have teacher observations, but it's only done by one teacher or all the teachers, we need to know that. So go ahead.
Oh,
Jackie. Yep,
yes.
go ahead. Sorry.
When it says teacher, is it the general education teacher or is it the special education teacher? And if you're asking a general education classroom teacher to do observations, that's a little challenging because they're also manning a whole classroom of multiple other students.
Mhm.
So to do effective observation is a little challenging.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yep. Okay, all right, I'm gonna go to goal 5. Does group 5 want to talk about their thoughts on goal 5 for data collection or questions about data collection?
So for this, it's really vague. Like, how are they gonna measure, like, what exactly does a student need to do to advocate for his needs? Like, kind of that situation, but also like, is the special education teacher gonna be with them all day in order to measure this? And like, is it gonna be it was already brought up before, like, is it gonna be the same person every single day?
Mhm.
Because different people have different views on behaviors and what that looks like and what a self-regulation should look like, right? So yeah, I don't know if anybody else from our group wants to.
Those are great
That's
points, Beth. Thank you.
pretty much, yeah, is that it's just too vague. It needs to be way more specific, and the regulation of emotions too, that needs to be kind of narrowed down a little bit. Because there could be all sorts of emotions in that field that particular student needs to work on.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of ties back to also with the objective, like how are we going to do objective observations by the special education teacher of how the child is regulating his emotions. Maybe he's not regulating his emotions, but he's, getting really, sick or anxious before school starts, and that's causing, he's acts normal for, part of the day when he's with a special education teacher, but not. And I guess the data will be collected by the special education teacher, but we have like no information. Like, is it going to be observations, or is there a form? Are we expecting the student to fill out some sort of like feedback response document? That's what, Caitlin had put in the chat here. What data will be collected? How will it be collected? How often it will be collected? Who's going to analyze the data? How is it going to be shared with us? Are we going to get, feedback to the IEP team once a month, just to see how he's doing, to see if we need to have changes to his IEP, or are we going to wait for the progress report? We just have data will be collected, which is good. I guess at least we have data is going to be collected, but what does that mean going forward? Because we need to know that in order to make sure that data is actually meaningfully being collected. Okay, goal number 6. Does goal number 6 group number 6 want to talk about goal number 6?
Yeah, I was selected by our team to talk about this one. I think similar to the last one, there's just not enough information there. It's a good goal in theory and that it's attainable. It's going from 50 to 80. But they just didn't really clarify enough of what's going on here. Like, are we talking about 50 to 80 days? Are we talking about time that's actually in the class versus out of the class? There's not any language around, is this a student that may have breaks written into their IEP,
Right.
or, that's acceptable. So, maybe they're only, maybe they've got a couple 5-minute breaks, so they wouldn't be in the class 100% of the time regardless. So good start, but not finished.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and when we do get the data, I guess we were going to need to know, like, if they are counting the breaks, or if do they account for missed appointments because they need to go with a speech teacher in a special room, that type of stuff. So I think that was really good. Thank you, Adam. Does anybody else have points to raise on goal number 6?
Hi, Laura. This is Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
I just wanted to mention that the annual goal doesn't look like it matches with the benchmark goals. Like,
That's
for him to be able to stay and attend class doesn't really work with student being able to complete assignments.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yep, the benchmarks are not tied to the student attending and staying in class. So, because working with others doesn't really matter for them to actually walk into the door, right? So that's a good point. Okay, all right, so just things to think about. For possible data collection changes, when you talk to your IEP teams for your meetings, having a special education staff member, like, have they been trained on IEP goals, the positive behavior support plan, and or data collection? And that's when we would want to lump in we need to have that as a support for the staff. Do we need to have the data collection forms brought to the IEP teaming so we can look through them to make sure they're meaningful? If there is a communication plan that we need to have between the parent and the school on collecting data. I've had families that have requested data collection on daily, like especially if there's concerns that are being expressed, where they're getting daily notes from the school staff on the child's behaviors, if any. But at least they come home every day so they know how the child's been doing in school. And that's helped if there is a buildup or concern of a child managing behavior or responses in school where the parents has been able to give feedback, not like at the moment, but in real time, right? Like the next day, like that didn't work because, you know, you need to give him space when he's getting angry, or that didn't work because, you know, yesterday he was just really mad that his favorite shirt was being washed, and today we have it cleaned and I bought a spare or whatever, right? Just to even offer some feedback on that has been helpful in some of my cases, just to ensure that there's frequent communication about data collection. Now, with some academic stuff, right, the progress might be a little bit slower versus like behavioral concerns, particularly if you have a school that might be proposing like a level 4 change or up to a level 3 change, and you need to try to navigate some of that. Asking for more frequent communication about the data collected might be helpful, whereas reading is, you know, maybe a slower process or skill building, right? But this would be just important to talk about. How is it going to be communicated? When is it going to be communicated? And do I need to ask, or are you just going to send it to me? Are the services and support in place to address the child's needs? If not, do we need to address anything? If we're having major academic concerns that we're seeing all of a sudden, what do we need to do to change this IEP? And so that might bring something that we would have gathered from our data collection, right? And then go and say, like, look at our data. We are seeing that there's been no progress in reading, and actually we are seeing a decrease in reading skill from the start of the year. We need to analyze this and figure out what we can do to change the goals, add more supports, remove services that aren't working, things like that, right? Having those conversations are crucial. If there's a disagreement on proposed goals or data collection, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but the first step is to, I guess, complete a PW1, that's the prior written notice, and we'll talk about all of this disagreement stuff next week, just so you know. But you would want to tell the school you disagree with how they're proposing goals. If their data collection information is not adequate in an IEP, tell the school that through that prior written notice. And then we would have that meeting with the school, conciliation, facilitated meetings, mediations. We'll go through all of that in a lot of detail next week. So, all right, we are at the 1 o'clock here. So I will bring up questions. If people have questions, we can talk about them. Otherwise, you can log off, of course, and we will see you next week. So is there any questions that we should address? Nope. That's good. Okay. All right. Well, I have helpful links at the end of the slide. I will get my slides out later this week for the last 3. I've just been busy with some stuff. And then Ruben, do you want to do our farewell slide?
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate you guys joining us. Again, thank you to our co-sponsors, the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities and Proof Alliance. As a reminder, we'll have a survey at the end of this 4th video. We look to see you next week.